Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. This is a presentation about how and why the chemical industry should pay for the management of its products. It is a joint project of CIEL, the Center for International Environmental Law, and IPEN, the International Pollutants Elimination Network. There is a detailed report on this topic, and a link to it will be provided at the end of the presentation. Let's get started with a look at how big the chemical industry actually is. This report from UN Environment has some interesting information about the chemical industry that may be surprising to many people. For example, it is the largest industrial consumer of energy and the third largest emitter of carbon dioxide. The industry is also projected to grow quite rapidly over the next 10 years. The chemical industry has rapidly expanded to Asia and the Middle East. The industry projects that by 2030, China will occupy more than 50% of global sales. The size of chemical industry sales is much bigger than most people realize. In 2017, the sales were nearly $6 trillion US. This large amount is projected to double by 2030. The scale we are talking about is in the trillions of US dollars. However, none of us are carrying around $1 trillion, and it is difficult to imagine just how big that is. So let's take a visual look at how big $1 trillion actually is. Here is a guy standing in front of a pile of $100 bills that adds up to 1 million US dollars. This amount would fit into a backpack. However, if we go up to $1 billion in cash, you can see that this is much more serious. Here we have 10 pallets and an enormous volume of money that climbs above his waist. It is difficult to prepare yourself for how big 1 trillion US dollars is, but here's an enormous array of double-stacked pallets, and our guy's standing here on the left. Now, the chemical industry makes almost 6 of these piles every year, and the industry is projected to approximately double that by 2030. The reason that the chemical industry is so profitable is shown here. The industry effectively privatizes or internalizes its profits, but externalizes or socializes many costs. These costs include serious harms to human health and the environment. This means that the industry does not pay for the true cost of its products. That's how the industry can maintain profit margins of 12 to 16%. You might be wondering if the need to internalize costs is a new idea. However, the world community gathered in 1992 at the Rio Earth Summit in Brazil and agreed on a series of principles. And these include Principle 16, which clearly states that environmental costs should be internalized and that the polluter should bear the cost of pollution. This is analogous to something we all learned as children, which is that we should clean up our own mess. At the root of the industry's externalized costs are these serious facts. As UN Environment has pointed out, hazardous chemicals and other pollution from the industry is still being released in large amounts. As a result, we can find the industry's products even in our own bodies and widely spread throughout the environment. It is difficult to put a monetary value on the industry's externalized costs, but here are 3 examples. These include illnesses due to endocrine disrupting chemicals, the costs associated with pollution from volatile organic compounds, and the cost of damage to human health from lead poisoning resulting from exposure to lead paint, lead battery recycling, and other sources. These all add up to substantial annual costs, and these are all costs that the industry does not pay. The chemical industry's externalized costs also include pesticide poisoning. Here is a calculation from UN Environment about how big this is in sub-Saharan Africa. The harm due to pesticide poisoning is actually much greater than the entire overseas development assistance to health, excluding HIV/AIDS. This estimate is from a report known as the cost of inaction. Death is another externalized cost of the chemical industry. This shocking statistic comes from the UN Special Rapporteur on Toxics, Baskut Tunjak. This is from a report he presented to the United Nations General Assembly in 2018. Now, we've seen a serious array of externalized costs from the chemical industry, and most people would think that this must mean that governments must be well financed in order to manage this large threat to human health and the environment. So let's have a look at the financing of international chemicals agreements. There are 5 main international agreements on chemicals and wastes. It is reasonable to ask how many of these have a financial mechanism. Many would expect that all of them should have a financial mechanism in order to enable developing and transition countries to implement them. However, only the Stockholm Convention and the Minamata Convention have a financial mechanism. So let's have a closer look at 2 of these agreements, the Stockholm Convention and the Strategic Approach to International Chemicals Management, which is also known as CIEL. The Stockholm Convention estimated how much money would be required for developing and transition countries to implement the obligations of the treaty. As you can see here, the amount of money needed to implement the treaty is more than 10 times the amount provided by the financial mechanism from the Global Environment Facility. This indicates a serious shortfall in funding in one of the few international chemicals agreements that actually has a financial mechanism. The financial situation of CIEL is even more serious. CIEL funding is only 0.2% of the Global Environment Facility budget. Ironically, CIEL is the agreement that covers the largest number of substances. So what we have is the agreement with the greatest scope having the smallest amount of money. In 2019, an independent evaluation of CIEL documented some of the consequences of inadequate financing. The evaluation draws a direct line between insufficient external donor funding and the inability of the agreement to achieve its objectives. This also impacted the Secretariat, which was severely underfunded for more than half of the 10-year period examined. The most serious consequence of this inadequate financing was undermining one of the most important objectives of the agreement, which was to narrow the gap between developed countries and developing and transition countries. The lack of financing for CIEL, the Stockholm Convention, and other chemicals agreements was no mystery to government delegates, and the solution became formulated as the integrated approach to financing. The integrated approach has 3 pillars: external financing, something which is vaguely referred to as industry involvement, and mainstreaming in development planning. Now, these are pictured here as 3 equal pillars, But in reality, it is the industry who should be internalizing its costs, and the industry contribution should be much greater than the other two. In order to operationalize the integrated approach to financing, what's needed is a tax on the production of basic chemicals. Basic chemicals are the group of substances used to make many other chemicals. You can read more about them in our report. Our proposal is to implement a vanishingly small tax of 0.5% on the production value of about 35 basic chemicals. This would be a very useful start on internalizing the industry's costs and for financing the regulatory infrastructure that is so badly needed in developing and transition countries. Here is how the tax would actually work. Countries that produce basic chemicals would levy a 0.5% tax on the production value of those chemicals and then contribute this money to a global fund for chemical safety. This would then be distributed to developing and transition countries to finance the sound management of chemicals and waste. You might be wondering how such a small tax could generate sufficient funds for financing the chemicals agenda, and some quick math can explain. If we look at the annual sales of basic chemicals and apply our extremely small tax on their production value, we can generate 11.5 billion US dollars each year for chemical safety actions in developing and transition countries. Another benefit of taxing basic chemicals is that sufficient funds can be generated even if only a small subset of countries implement the tax. For example, this data from the United Nations Industrial Development Organization shows that about 77% of basic chemicals production value occurred in only these 10 countries. This information should be updated as the proposal moves forward. Internalization of industry costs can occur at both the national and global levels. We have presented a global level proposal, and here are the reasons why. The first reason is that countries that do not produce chemicals cannot really generate sufficient money from a national tax. A global system like the one we have proposed would generate sufficient financing for these and other countries. The second reason is that if one country establishes a tax on its industry, it could incentivize the industry to move to the neighboring country. In contrast, a global system provides a level playing field. The third reason is that while a national cost recovery system does partly implement the polluter pays principle, the actual nature of the industry includes global manufacturing and trade, and the industry is often not subject to taxation or regulation in countries where pollution control is needed. So it is preferable to have a global financial mechanism along the lines that we have proposed. Here are the key elements of our proposal. The first is that the chemical industry is extremely profitable and predicted to double in size by 2030 with sales of more than 11 trillion US dollars. The reason the industry is so rich is because the vast majority of environmental and human health costs linked to chemicals production, use, and disposal are not paid for by the industry. Governments understand that this is bad economics, and that is why industry involvement is a key pillar of the integrated approach to financing. Governments understand that the industry is responsible for its products and that the external costs of production, use, and disposal of chemicals should be shifted from the public sector to the private sector. The chemicals agenda is severely underfunded. One good example is SciChem, in which the agreement with the broadest scope has only 0.2% of the Global Environment Facility budget for financing. We are proposing a coordinated tax on basic chemicals production. This would involve countries collecting an extremely small tax and then channeling that money to a global chemical safety fund for distribution to developing and transition countries for actions on chemical safety. This approach would operationalize the integrated approach to financing and the polluter pays principle, and it would actually provide funding on the scale that is needed. Sustainable sufficient funding is critical for achieving the sound management of chemicals and wastes. We think this can best be accomplished by a coordinated international approach to taxes on chemical producers. Thank you very much for your attention. For more information about how a small coordinated tax on basic chemicals can provide substantial, sustainable funding for chemicals and waste management, please see our detailed report at these links.